Chapter 21. Holly stared at the empty folds of green silk. "Miss Claus, please do come along. It's nearly 7 o'clock," Mr. Kleiner's voice called from the shop floor. She turned the cloth over, as if expecting to find some overlooked pocket within. It remained green and empty. "Where could they be?" she whispered. "Wherever they are, it was undoubtedly Lexi's idea," murmured Tundra. "I expect that she got bored and persuaded the other two to go exploring with her. It's just like her." "But I can't leave without them." "I don't see why not. Serves them right." "Miss Claus!" Yes, I'm coming," said Holly, giving in. She gathered her things. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kleiner." Tundra glanced at her shrewdly. She was up to something. "That's quite all right, my dear. Now, you have your doll money?" "Yes, sir." "Should give it all to me, Mr. Kleiner," contradicted Jeremy, "for the kids' dinner." Mr. Kleiner turned to Holly with a frown. "Miss Claus, forgive me for interfering in your personal affairs, but you must keep some for yourself. I have also given Jeremy some compensation for his hard work." "I kept a bit for myself, Mr. Kleiner. You needn't worry," said Holly, smiling at his anxiety. "Shall we be off?" In a matter of minutes, Holly, Tundra, and Mr. Kleiner had waved goodbye to Jeremy, who was going to visit Lissy, and settled in the handsome cab with sighs of contentment. They sat back, absorbed in their own reflections, Mr. Kleiner totaling and retotaling the day's astonishing profits in his head, soon fell into a light doze. Holly was imagining Lissy in the splendor of Dr. Bronfield's house. "Perhaps she has a canopy bed," Holly mused, "and a ruffled nightgown." Her aimless gaze fell upon a tall figure striding along the sidewalk next to the cab. She could see only the back of his black overcoat, just one of the thousands of black overcoats that darken the streets of New York City on a winter's day, but the stride was singular and familiar. She leaned forward to see the face, but he had slipped around a little cluster of pedestrians into the shadow of a building. He was tall, that much was clear. He wore a smooth black bowler, and he had a large bundle under one arm. Was it Mr. Hartman? And if so, why was he walking so determinedly through the slush of 3rd Avenue? Holly pressed her face against the smudged glass, but the cab was pulling ahead of the figure in the black coat despite his swift pace. There was something terribly familiar about that walk, the swing of it. Was it Mr. Carroll? Suddenly, Holly felt an intense wish for the pedestrian to be Mr. Carroll. She wanted to see him, to watch the shadows in his eyes without him knowing that she did so. She pulled down the glass window and leaned out, hoping that one more glimpse would reveal the stranger to be her employer. But she was thwarted. The black coat her eyes were seeking halted before a granite staircase that led to a large official edifice. Now he was climbing the stairs. The cab jerked to a stop at a corner, and Holly peered back toward the building. There were letters inscribed on it, which Holly read sideways. "St. Cecilia's Home for Foundlings." And now the tall figure was descending the stairs at a great pace. She squinted, but all she could see was that the bundle was missing. Whoever it was, Mr. Hartman or Mr. Carroll, he had delivered something to the Home for Foundlings. "What's a foundling?" she asked. "What's that, my dear?" asked Mr. Kleiner, starting from his nap. "Foundlings? Orphans, you know. Children found without parents. Foundlings." He subsided back into his snooze, and Holly closed the window. The cab rumbled on. Tundra nudged her inquiringly, but he couldn't ask what she had seen, and she was glad. She didn't want to talk. She was thinking of the door at the end of the hallway, of the great dark clock face. She was thinking of his hands brushing away shavings of wood as he worked, and then his hands outstretched to hers for one electric moment in the shadowy corridor. Her heart was beating rather rapidly. Tundra observed her with a frown. Something was happening to her, he knew that much, but he could not guess what it might be. Her cheeks were pale, and her green eyes, which were fundamentally incapable of disguising their owner's soul, showed only that she had received some sort of shock. As he stared, confounded, she suddenly smiled. The color came flooding back into her cheeks. She had never looked more beautiful. "My dear child, you must make haste. Have you anything to wear?" cried Mrs. Kleiner when they arrived. Holly, flying up the stairs, halted. "What does one wear to the opera? Why, your best, Miss Claus, your best. Thank goodness for Lexi, Holly murmured, and ran up the steps with Tundra at her heels. A moment later, she was clad in waves of golden silk. She rustled to and fro, inspecting the minute slivers of herself that she could see in a tiny mirror above the bureau. Tundra, she asked plaintively, do I look all right, or do I look foolish? Tundra lifted his head and regarded her judiciously. You don't look foolish, he said slowly. You look like a queen. Holly laughed at that, but then her face fell. Oh, no, I forgot about the opera house. How will my heart bear it? She stared at him in dismay. I'm already almost warm. She went to her window balcony and flung open the door. A shushing sigh of snow fluttered into her hair, and beckoned by the cool air, she stepped outside. She closed her eyes, raising her face to the eddies of gentle snow, and then, just as certainly as the snow shawl had circled her the night before, she felt herself enveloped in a light web of coolness. She opened her eyes and beheld the magic crystals, now embedded like jewels in the fabric of her dress, making a pattern of enchanted golden lace on the cascading silk. She peered into the night sky for the giver of the gift and murmured, once again, always, thank you. 10 minutes later, she descended. When she entered the parlor, Mrs. Kleiner let out an involuntary gasp of admiration, and Mr. Kleiner leapt to his feet as though pulled on puppet strings. My word, he muttered, taking off his glasses. You're perfectly lovely. I've never seen such a color, said Mrs. Kleiner. Where on earth did you find it? A friend gave it to me, said Holly honestly. Good night, dear Mrs. Kleiner. Good night, Mr. Kleiner. Good night. Where's your coat? Cried the lady of the house, scandalized, but Holly pretended not to hear, and, slipping out the door, she and Tundra found themselves out in the great city at night. I'll be right here, Tundra was saying. Holly, are you paying attention? Right here, by this pillar. By this pillar, repeated Holly obediently. She nodded, but her eyes followed a monumental dowager in peacock blue satin, who was borne from her carriage in the arm of a smiling young man, in a collar so stiff it seemed on the verge of slitting his throat. Holly looked on, enthralled. Tundra sighed and waited. The dowager and her escort were absorbed into the gilded lobby of the Metropolitan Opera House. Exquisitely dressed ladies and gentlemen streamed toward the lustrous theater, and Holly's eyes were full of black broadcloth and dazzling white linen, paired with explosions of brilliantly colored silk and velvet. Holly, Tundra hissed through clenched teeth. He wasn't supposed to be talking, but the cream of society that flowed by him was so hypnotized by its own elegance that it could not be bothered to take note of a talking wolf. I'll be here if you need me. Finally, Holly pulled her eyes away from the crowd. He had her attention. I know you will, she said. Tundra was relieved. She had heard him. Well, he said, go on then. Have a good time. In the falling snow, he watched as she climbed the marble steps, her back straight and her steps light. He could not see her face, but he could see her effect on the crowd around her. Several dozen women looked once and then twice, their faces sharp with interest and curiosity. The men accompanying them looked once and then kept looking furtively. A tall man, his smile boastful, stepped forward to claim her arm. Jealous eyes followed the slim figure clad in what seemed to be a cascade of liquid gold, and her companion as they ascended the great staircase. Every man in the Metropolitan Opera House wishes he were in my shoes, Hunter Hartman said, glancing about. You are magnificent. He lifted the hand that rested on his arm to his lips. Look around you, he murmured. Look at them watching you. Holly looked. There were indeed a number of faces turned toward her, but Hartman seemed to glow excessively. It gave Holly a peculiar feeling, as though she was his possession to parade before the spectators. She lifted her chin defiantly and changed the subject. What are we hearing tonight? Othello, he shrugged. Not quite as cheerful an evening as I had hoped, though the risk is sure to be good. Holly turned to him, delighted. But this is wonderful, she exclaimed. I've always longed to hear one of Maestro Verdi's operas, and they say this is among his greatest." He looked at her alertly. "Where do you come from, child? How is it that you know Verdi, but have never heard even one of his operas? The old man's written such a pile of them they would seem unavoidable." "Where I come from," stammered Holly, blushing a little as she tried to find words, "it's very forested, and there aren't any opera houses." She lifted her eyes to his and realized with surprise that he didn't believe her, and he didn't care. His mouth was stretched into an odd smile. He turned his head away and said very softly, "Oh, how I am going to enjoy this evening." "And so am I," said Holly. He did not answer, but lifted her hand again, expertly turning the palm upward and pressing his warm lips against her wrist. A faint shudder of revulsion buzzed through her. Their box, swathed in velvet of midnight blue and encrusted with gilt in every possible location, afforded Holly and Mr. Hartman an unobstructed view of the stage. It also afforded them a view of the Diamond Horseshoe, the semicircle of boxes that belonged to the aristocracy of New York, which were handed down from one generation to the next. Holly's eyes danced as she watched the Morgans and the Vanderbilts, resplendent in diamonds and icy in manners, nod to one another from their thrones. Down in the orchestra prowled what appeared to be an army of penguins. Young men with plenty of money and perfectly cut evening clothes roved through the theater, stopping to flirt with any lady, young or old, or sufficient social standing to capture their interest. Holly's presence was having a rather strong effect upon this portion of the opera-going population. More than a dozen young men who had been cultivating their taste for ladies less decorative than wealthy found their inner economy upset by Holly's glowing smile and capricious curls. One Mr. Law peered through his opera glass and fumed. "Know the girl from somewhere. Can't quite put my finger on it. Who's that fellow she's with?" "Never saw him before. Doesn't deserve her," grumbled young Mr. Knapp. Holly, oblivious to the opera glasses trained upon her, was enjoying herself immensely. It was all so grand. The humming crowd, the ladies like gauzy butterflies, the lavish golden ceiling where muses wafted on gilded clouds. The whole bubbling world of it entered her blood like champagne. Catching sight of the most majestic of all the society queens, she leaned forward to touch Mr. Hartman's arm. "Look at her. Is that a belt of diamonds?" she whispered. "She can't possibly breathe." "That's Mrs. Astor," he replied. He looked down at Holly. "Do you know who she is?" "No. Is she someone important?" Mr. Hartman laughed and laid his hand casually over the rail of the box, pointing a finger in the direction of Mrs. Astor. As if pulled by an invisible rope, the regal head turned, and Mrs. Astor, appearing vaguely surprised, nodded toward their box. Mr. Hartman nodded coolly back. Mechanically, the grand dame turned her eyes away. "Do you know her?" asked Holly, impressed. "I've met her once or twice," said Hunter Hartman. And then the curtain began to rise. The lights dimmed and the crowd hushed. Holly leaned forward, eager for every note. And as she did so, a slight disturbance several boxes away caught her attention. She glanced over and instantly dropped her eyes, for there, not more than 20 feet from her, was Mr. Carroll, taking a solitary seat in a box. Secretively, she looked in his direction, distracted by the sight of him removing a pair of opera glasses from the pocket of his evening jacket. He sat back in his seat, obviously prepared to enjoy the opera. She realized with relief and regret that he had not seen her. After a short internal struggle, she lifted her head, let him see that she was not just a plain little shop girl, but a young lady in an evening gown. She smoothed the golden folds of her dress. "That's enough fussing," she scolded herself. "Just listen." Soon she had forgotten everything but the music. The story of Othello and Desdemona unfolded, and Holly was lost in the inexorable tide of the characters' fates, watching with fascinated horror as the heart of Othello was dismantled by Iago for the sport of it. So intent was Holly upon the tragedy before her that the intermission, when it came, seemed a rude interruption. She looked around hazily, and Hunter Hartman, whose interest in the proceedings on stage appeared to be limited, smiled at her confusion. "Do you care to take a turn in the lobby, or shall I bring you an ice?" "Oh, no," said Holly vehemently. "I don't want anything for it to begin again. I don't want anything but for it to begin again. It's wonderful. Aren't the voices beautiful?" "No, you are." She ignored him and stared at the dropped curtain. "I never imagined it would be so exciting," she murmured. "It makes me shiver." She held up a trembling hand. "Permit me," said Mr. Hartman, capturing her hand in his. Holly slipped from his grasp. "Mr. Hartman, I believe I would like that ice you mentioned," she said. "Something cool would be helpful." The enchanted snow that glittered on her dress struggled against the pressing heat of 3,600 people in evening dress. "At your service, Miss Claus." He paused at the small gilded door. "I hate to leave a young lady without protection. I do hope you won't mind if I avail myself of the key. Many confounded young fools have been known to walk into a box without invitation." He did not wait for her reply, but exited quickly. She heard the golden key turn in the lock. "He really is rather strange," Holly decided, "always staring with those eyes. But he can't be bothered to listen to me. Odd. Maybe all mortal men are that way. No, that's not true. Not Mr. Kleiner. Not Dr. Braunfels. They listen. And Mr. Carroll?" Shyly, she stole a look at his box. He was leaning forward, scanning the seats below. He stood and peered at the boxes above him. Frowning, he resettled himself in his seat and glared at the small program in his hands. Whatever can he be about? Holly wondered, watching him shred the little paper book with an abstracted air. And why doesn't he look this way? Click. The sound of the key turning in the lock brought her back to the present. Mr. Hartman delivered her ice with gallant inquiries as to her comfort and general well-being. Feeling somehow guilty, she rewarded him with a smile and consumed the delicious coolness in silence. She was relieved when the lights dimmed and the curtain rose again. Her relief, however, was short-lived. From then on, the terrible descent of Othello was almost more than she could stand. When the villain ground the fallen hero under his heel, Holly had to tear her eyes away. She glanced at her boxmate. He was more absorbed in this spectacle than in any other the opera had provided, and he seemed to know the music well, for he swayed in time to Iago's taunts. Unnerved, Holly looked towards Carol's box. The lonely occupant sat still as a statue, his jaw set, his eyes lost in shadows. The last mournful strains of the song finished, and the house erupted into crashing applause. Holly, clapping fervently, stole another look at the nearby box. It was empty. It was a small world, the one that glittered so brightly. The same elegant women and men who had occupied the boxes of the opera house now swept toward the cream and gold brocade seats of Delmonico's. They stopped to chat here and there, leaning confidently down to receive or dispense gossip, laughing in low voices, extending a well-kept hand in greeting. Holly watched, but she found she was beginning to wish for somebody, anybody, who looked just a little bit different. She felt a sharp longing for Tundra, who cared nothing for any of this kind of show, and thought humans should have fur. But while she was in the most famous restaurant in New York, he was outside, sitting uncomfortably in the snow. She sighed inwardly and tried to attend to Mr. Hartman. He was telling her stories of his cosmopolitan youth in Paris and London, and though she had always longed to travel to these grand cities, she found herself strangely unmoved by his tales of balls, royal receptions, yacht races, or fox hunts. Only to discover that it was the Duke himself. Mr. Hartman concluded a story she should have been listening to. Holly smiled noncommittally. He looked at her with a flash of impatience before his face relaxed into a warm smile. "Are you tired, Miss Claus?" he asked, moving his chair close to hers. "No, really, I'm not," she said, sitting up straighter than before. "I'm still in a daze from that sad, sad story, I think." "What, the opera?" He seemed to find this amusing. "Just a tale, child, just a story. You shouldn't take it to heart." "How can you not?" Holly asked. "Didn't it stir your feelings?" He shrugged. "The male animal is not so easily stirred as that, my dear. An opera, even one by your Maestro Verdi, cannot evoke in me even one fraction of the emotion that a moment's glimpse of you can, and does." "A moment's glimpse of me," she repeated. "I don't think I understand the things you say, Mr. Hartman." In reply, his eyes wandered slowly over her, dropping from her eyes to her mouth, to the escaped tendrils of hair that curled at her neck. Holly felt a flush of embarrassment rising in her cheeks, but Mr. Hartman continued his slow perusal of her face, and she lowered her eyes to the snowy tablecloth. He reached out and gently took her chin between two fingers. "Look at me," he demanded. She pulled away from his warm hand and met his eyes. "I think you understand me perfectly," he continued. "I think you know that I find you bewitching, that you have not left my mind for a moment since I saw you in the park 2 days ago, and that I have done everything in my power to put myself in your way, and that I will not rest until I make you mine." He drew his thumb along the edge of her jaw, watching, with a pleased smile, the bewildered alarm in her face. "I know none of this," said Holly quickly, "and I don't want to know it." She battled an urge to run from the table, for that would be rude. She shook her head. "Please, Mr. Hartman, take your hand away. I don't like it. And I never saw you in the park," she added. But I saw you," he said, "and I followed you to that wretched shop. So the toys you bought today, they weren't for anyone?" "They were for me," he said. "They gave me a way to be with you. Wasn't I clever?" He pulled a thin blue box from his coat pocket and set it on the tablecloth. "Look, I bought you a toy, too." He flicked the catch and the box sprang open. There, on a bed of velvet, lay a magnificent collar of diamonds and pearls. "It's very beautiful," said Holly politely, "but I could never accept such a gift." "Nonsense," he said, picking it up and looking closely at the diamonds. "It will look splendid on you. You really have quite an elegant neck, my dear. You will be an ornament to society, I guarantee it." He stood up and moved behind her chair. She felt his warm hands fumbling on her locket's chain. "How do you take this ridiculous thing off?" he muttered. "There's no clasp." "Sit down," said Holly tensely. "Sit down at once." Mr. Hartman laughed and sat. "What is it, Holly? May I call you Holly, my dear?" "No, no, you may not." Mr. Hartman's complacent smile faded. "I see," he said angrily. "You don't want to be won too easily. Come, my dear, don't be foolish. It's the life you want. I can give it to you. In return, all I ask is you." Holly stared at him, outraged. "How do you presume to know what sort of life I want? You know nothing about me. Nothing. But I will tell you one thing. I don't want the life you seem to be offering me." Hunter Hartman shifted in his seat and looked sullenly at the untouched glass of champagne upon the table. "You want the necklace, don't you?" he said. "Go ahead and take it. It doesn't have to mean anything." "What are you talking about?" asked Holly vehemently. "I don't want your necklace." She stood, her cheeks pale now with anger. "Good night, Mr. Hartman." "No!" he cried, seizing her hand. He stood, too, and his face was twisted with panic. "No, Miss Claus. Please sit. It was my fault. I was too pressing. I asked nothing but to be in your presence." He saw Holly's startled look. "Here, I'll throw the necklace away if it offends you. See?" He tossed it on the table. "Of course, you wouldn't want to exchange your lovely locket for such a vulgar collar. I can understand that perfectly," he babbled. "Perfectly, for your locket is charming. Charming, yes, charming." He swallowed, and she saw thin beads of perspiration crawl down his cheeks. He stammered on. "It is very like one my grandmother wore. May God rest her soul. Bless me, the similarity is remarkable. Would you be so kind as to permit me to inspect it? Without waiting for an answer, he reached his hand out to touch the old gold. But Holly was too quick for him. She leapt up and swiftly walked through the restaurant and out into the snowy night.